messed it up, but I'm very grateful that you've come to our program. And basically, we are a public policy think tank. We work in public policy, mental health, and public health. And we've launched an online campaign called Corona Ke Bhoy Corona to tackle the psychiatric problems during COVID-19. And today we are joined by Dr. Amit Pattajoshi, who's a senior psychiatrist and member of the Executive Council of Indian Psychiatric Society. Along with that, we'll be joined by Dr. Ujjani Halim. She's the director of IMSE Kolkata, and also she's the associate with a number of UN bodies, and she's an ex-PhD from the University of Heidelberg. So we'll take two questions each.
And
Me,
where is she based out of?
Dr. Halim did a PhD from Heidelberg, and she was in UN in Rome. And currently, she's associated with the United Nations, a number of committees, and she also has her own NGO called IMSE.
Good to see you, all of you. Good to meet you virtually.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
sir. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So which part of the world you are in at the moment?
Right now, I'm locked in Kolkata, sir.
Oh, you all are in Kolkata.
Sir, I am in
Locked,
Bhubaneswar.
yes, under lockdown. Yeah.
And who is in Bhubaneswar?
Sir, I said, Dr. Amrit. I'm a psychiatrist from Bhubaneswar.
And sir, you know me for a long time, but basically, I'll be leaving for UK soon. I've got a job in the University of Birmingham as a senior clinical fellow in psychiatry. So this period we were in Calcutta because of the lockdown. We can't go to UK, so we used our time for.
UK has come to your home now. Nobody needs to go anywhere. Whether you like it or not.
That is true.
There's all virtual studies.
Yes, but so yeah, we're waiting for that, and we've our organization has done a lot of work in regards to psychiatry. If you give us time, I can come and we can share ideas with you with regards to mental health. We are operating a 24/7 helpline to psychiatric services. So we'll start formally. Uh, a very good morning to all of you. A good afternoon to all of you. I'm welcoming all our guests and panelists on behalf of CAB Foundation. Today's guest of honor is Mr. Dinesh Trivedi. He does not need the introduction. He's a member of parliament and ex-railway minister, government of India. He completed his education from Xavier's and went and studied in the University of Texas. And he has been a parliamentarian for a long period of time. And very surprisingly, he was also a pilot and trained as a pilot. So that is something which few of us know. We are very grateful to him to join our forum and support our cause. Along with him, we have co-panelist Dr. Amit Pattajoshi. He's a senior psychiatrist and he's the member of the Executive Council of the Indian Psychiatric Society and HOD of a leading medical college in Orissa. And we're also joined by Dr. Ujjani Halim. Uh, she's associated with a number of UN agencies and she's also the director of IMSE based in Kolkata, and currently she works with UN and other international organizations. So thank you, sir. I would request Dr. Amit Pattajoshi to ask a few questions to Dr. Dinesh Bhai about mental illness and the importance of linking public policy, political people, and psychiatrists to push the cause of mental illness and mental health in India. So over to Dr. Amit Pattajoshi.
Thank you so much, sir. So as you know that everywhere we are hearing about COVID, everywhere. But one of the important implications, other than the medical implication, is a lot of psychosocial stress, sir. People are losing jobs. People are not able to come out of their home. People are not getting what they were used to. People were not doing what they were doing. So a new normal has come. But adjustment, adaptability, and then persisting with the current changes is a very, very important thing. Many of us might not be able to adjust to those things, leading to a rise in psychological stress, leading to a lot of morbidity in the population. So you as a public person, as a policy maker, and as somebody who can move governments, move the people, post-endemic, how would you plan to take care of these things in terms of the rural people, in terms of the urban people? We need a lot of psychiatrists, we need a lot of, so how do you plan to do these things, sir? Or what would be your suggestions to go about things, sir?
Well, first of all, thank you so very much for having me here. And I just don't claim to be an expert in this kind of field. You are the expert. But having been in public life, and our biggest advantage is to be in India. So India itself is a philosophical and a spiritual country. And this is the time where all we have learned from our parents, from our gurus, from our teachers, and the first thing is how to be mentally strong
Sir.
and how to have your confidence. So I think as a public figure, uh, one of our main job is to make sure that we create all sorts of trust into people. And I can just give you my example. I was a junior minister for health uh, during this uh, 209 H1N1. I'm sure all of us remember that.
Yes, sir.
Uh, the first thing what we decided when that was also pandemic. When it came, the first thing we decided in-house is no panic. We need to understand what are we up to. We need to be intelligently up to date. And I don't call this enemies or war. These are all, I don't know why people have started. We are not at the war. We are at a situation. In life, situations come. If you are in a beach playing around on a holiday, suddenly tsunami comes. People were not prepared. At least this situation has given us time. Earthquake, people are not prepared. Uh, Hailstorm, tornadoes, lightning. So first of all, we'll have to understand, and that is what I feel we tell. Like I said, you are an expert. But the job of people in public life is to give them that kind of faith and trust in themselves and confidence that we are at a situation, collectively we'll have to deal with this situation. There are no magics. We all have to understand it and we have to come out of it. We have come out of many situations. So in short, I'm going to be using that, and that's what I do. And for doing that, first of all, you have to be sure about your mental state of affairs. And India is blessed because we have joint family. See, the problem with the West is they're lonely. They can't even share their fear, their anxiety, their emotions. So, first of all, how do we really control our emotions within? So, first thing, two main problems here as far as COVID 19 is concerned. First thing, no fear. The fear factor will not be if there is no panic. And second thing is, don't attach stigma. There is too much of stigma. There is too much of fear. I think we all collectively need to go out and be positive. And one of the things I must share, I have stopped watching television. I have stopped reading newspapers. Updates we need, that comes, and that's it. You just watch the updates and forget about it. So these are the few words I have to say, and we carry on the conversation.
Well, I thank Dinesh Bhai, Mr. Dinesh Trivedi for his lovely words. And sir, you will be happy to know that on behalf of CAV, we've published a policy paper on the psychiatric response to COVID-19. And one of the points which you raised was that people should not watch news. People should not watch
So
too
we're on
much.
the same page.
What you said, we've actually written that in our papers because there's a scientific basis to that. And I think the thing you said about Indian family system was very relevant. So you also spoke about a stigma related to COVID-19. So I have a very specific question. There's a lot of stigma related to mental health. You know that mental illness is one of the most stigmatized medical disciplines in our country. And if someone has mental problems, they don't go to a doctor because they're rated as pagals. So you've been health minister and you're also a public person. what do you think we as psychiatrists or you as a person who devises policy can do to remove mental illness stigma in India?
I think the stigma starts from home. And if there are, let's say, two brothers and three sisters or whatever the combination, right from the beginning, unfortunately, it starts with parents. Oh, he's, in, we say, Arey, he's mentally disturbed, don't do this. Arey, tum to pagal hai. So the person may be super intelligent. And doctors being here, you'll know your mom is a great doctor, very popular, everybody knows her, and she is always out there to help every sort of people. So it starts from the beginning at home. And then like mentally disturbance is much more predominant in the Western world. And again, I would say because of our joint family structure. It's a positive and it's negative also. Positive in a sense, it's a stress buster. And negative in a sense that many parents say, "Arey, wo to pagal hai. Tumhara bhai to kamzor hai." And especially it starts from the school. So like I said, I'm not an expert in this field, but again, I think the public policy on these kind of things should be guided by experts and not necessarily by politicians. Because many times, with due respect, politicians also require help.
Sir, when we are speaking of mental health, sir, there's a lot of research which we have done as a think tank and other scientists have done. And the opinion is that medical education and higher education in universities in India lag behind the West. For example, we don't have a single medical college or biomedical research facility in India which comes in the top 100 QS rankings, whereas we have places like Johns Hopkins in America which do a lot of work. And in psychiatry, sir, the research is very cutting edge, brain mapping and other things. Now, there are papers which suggest that there is requirement of more funding into higher education in medical colleges and research, especially in India. We don't have much research in medical education. So, sir, you were health minister yourself and you're also an MP. What are your views on this? And if you can perhaps give an advocacy to the government on this very important issue.
See why, let's say a country like America. Why is America today number one country in the world as far as innovations are concerned? They are number one not necessarily because of the government, it's because of the universities, right?
Yeah.
And the universities have a lot of funds, and these funds come from endowment. So universities like MIT and Stanford and Harvard and Berkeley would easily will have 30 or 25 or 40 billion dollars of endowment funds. We need to encourage our business people who give money outside. If you look at, for example, Tata's, they give a lot of money to MIT. I am aware of it. Somewhere down the line, like if you have made 2% cess for social responsibility and stuff like that. Similarly, I think there should be a public policy that those who have that turnover after a particular percentage must give a percentage, I do not know what could be that percentage, to the universities. Because if government, first of all, government also should give without interference. The problem is when government gives grant, there is a lot of interference. So my idea is twofold. One is de-link the institution for higher education with the government. In other words, the government should not have any interference. And if that means that government won't fund, so be it. So that is why you will have, places like Ashoka universities have come in Delhi. Private sector has a lot to do with higher education, and without funding, you cannot have proper innovation in any of the field. Because if you need good professor, what is a university made of? It is not only the concrete building structure. You require instructors, you require professors, you require professors who is continuously studying themselves, and they take along the students. So it's a great team of the professors and the students. And that's where the learning becomes very interesting. And the learning is not only to get a PhD degree or to get an MS or to get an MBA, it's a process. And I think we need to change that thing. And I must tell you, while we are talking about that, today most of our university, unfortunately, have become politicized. If I see student elections at Delhi University, or for that matter, universities here in Kolkata itself, they are political flags. Get rid of them. I was the president of a student union in Texas, and we had thousands of students. Never there was any flag of a Democrat or a Republican or whatever it is, or a Tea Party. No. You have your thing, no question. You get all the speakers from various fields, whether they're Democrat, they're Republican, doesn't matter. But as far as the university is concerned, the student organization is only there to do what is good for the university. And there is no political involvement there. Each and every student are well within right to have their kind of ideology. But that was not affecting the learning. So we have a long way to go, and people like you and your team could start somewhere. Otherwise, I'm afraid, in spite of the best brains we have in the world, best, no comparison, the biggest country in the world are run by Indians. Today, when you see on TV, the best experts, doctors are Bengalis, and that is where, we need to engage our talent within, and that can only come with reform in education system, and especially higher education.
Sir, in regards to education, sir, I have another very pointed question.
Dr. Baidyanath, before you move on with
Yes.
your next question, I just have one additional small question to sir here. So, sir, I mean, after listening to you, is it correct to conclude or understand that you were talking, you were basically pushing for more privatization of higher education, or you are basically referring to a regulated higher education system where there could be a tax reform and the money could come from a particular class?
I really don't understand what is privatization and what is state. Like, the reason I keep on talking about America, because they have given us, and I'm talking about higher education.
Yes.
I'm not talking about primary or secondary schools. That model has become successful, and you have state-funded universities. Texas was one of the state-funded universities. But at the same time, the private endowment was also there. But even if the state is funding, there is not much of interference from the state government.
Right.
So I don't care whether it is private or state, as long as the state doesn't dictate you what syllabus you should follow. If somebody says that,
It's basically, sir, it's about the power. I mean, whoever is dictating is wrong. As you were saying, there should be a healthy space for learning, and education is not only about certificate, if I may understand it that way. Because, there are a lot of issues on privatization of higher education. I studied in Germany for a long time, and most of the universities are state funded. And yes, endowment funds are also there. But then there is a state regulation, which is ensuring the quality of the higher studies and higher education. So, if we completely detach state from the universities and we totally depend on private funds for running universities, there may be other kinds of risks. That's just my personal observation here. But otherwise, I totally agree that we need to disassociate politicization of university and the student space and all. That's very true.
so I'll just give you an example. If supposing the dean of a particular discipline needs to be appointed by a good university, whether in England or Cambridge, let's say. I don't think so. The Prime Minister of United Kingdom will say, no, appoint this particular person. So appointment of vice chancellors, why on earth? Why on earth vice chancellor should be appointed by government? Why on earth the Vishwa Bharati University, the vice chancellor should be the Prime Minister of India? Why? What quality he brings? Why? I mean, our entire education needs to be totally rigid and keep away the political side. If somebody, if somebody like, we have Dr. Kakuli Ghosh there, since her son is there, that's why I'm referring, that she's a doctor and she wants to take a couple of classes. She could be an MP also, she could be a minister also. But not because she is an MP or minister, but because she is a doctor. I am a pilot. If there is something on aviation and if I'm called, that's a different story because you have a domain knowledge about that particular area. So the way we are going with our education, I am sorry, but I have no hesitation in telling, because Indians are brilliant and they're big numbers. That's why you will have brilliance going out. We do not, and I repeat, we do not respect our talent. Why is China so ahead? Because they respect the talent. So all those Chinese students go back. Indian students, they don't care. Even if they have to live in a village, they don't care. They are not looking for a Mercedes car. They are looking for an environment where there would be free and fair exchange of thoughts. They will get the environment and their innovation and all would be seriously looked into. Here, I'm sorry, I mean, I've been a minister, I know how it works. The bureaucrat won't even let him inside. His idea will be thrown away. Unless a big, huge multinational or, Anand Mahindra or somebody says, "Arey, this is my project." "Arey, this is your project?" Okay, let's see. They don't realize that behind the project is a young girl coming in from Germany and she has given this project. But referring to you, young girl from Germany going straight into a ministerial office, छोड़ दो उसको. अच्छा आप पेपर दे के रख जाओ, हम आपको बुला लेंगे. Nothing happens. If Anand Mahindra or ABC goes, then they say, "Oh yeah, right. Let's talk." This MyBap culture needs to go. I can tell you, it has not gone. On the contrary, it is becoming worse. And I'm not on a political brownie point. Whether it is state government, whether it is federal government, we are all on the same page. We are all suffering from this malaise. Otherwise,
Sir,
in this story, sorry,
Sir,
go ahead.
I would say something in this regard before giving the forum to Amitji and Ujjanidhi. Sir, on behalf of CAB, we work in mental health, public policy, and public health. Now, our public policy team have actually studied different models in different parts of the world. Now, we have studied primary and secondary education and also university education. We found the school education system in Finland to be very good. I'm not going to the details of it, but we've seen that the Finland government gives a lot of impetus to public primary, secondary education, but the teachers are great. Education is very diverse. They have happiness classes and it is very individualistic education. And the teachers who teach in Finland, all of them have PhDs and they are good at their jobs. And when we went into the college model and university model, I will agree with you that the American system really works. Like I have worked in Johns Hopkins for a brief period before my residency. Now, sir, Johns Hopkins is not a private university. It is not a government university. It is a non-profit endowment university, and it has total autonomy. So it doesn't have government control, but it works like a very corporate machine. And there's a lot of money which goes into research, into training, and every day the work which is done, both in medicine and research, it is changing the face of medicine. And I completely agree with you that we need innovation in education. So my question to you is very pointed that the foreign university education bill, it's still pending in parliament, like it hasn't been passed. So, sir, you are a member of parliament. If you could give some direction and if we could work with CAV to build some policy papers, study different models of education, both in school and college, and give a direction to India, then what would your advice be? And how do you think forums can work with MPs like you in this regard?
See, first thing, I really do not know at what stage it is because I again re-entered Parliament recently, as you know, in Rajya Sabha. So this bill has to go to the standing committee. I don't know whether it has gone or not. And at that standing committee, individually and collectively, those who are members of that, uh, I think it will come on a human resource. You need to give them your point of view, your ideas, what it should be. And I think your group should go before the committee as witness and give your papers. But unfortunately, what happens also in these committees, most of their recommendations are just on paper. I am not very, what word I should use, I don't know. I'm not very optimistic that anything will change because people want. It is the government's mindset. The mindset of the government has to change. And you need to keep on trying. And we as members of parliament need to keep on raising this issue. Not one time, we have to keep on various forums. You need to have a lot of public participation. You have to go all out. You have to have seminars. You have to go to it's a very hard work. Democracy is not easy. But you need to do all that is possible. And as somebody who's interested in reform in public policy and education, I can only tell you that I'm there whenever you want, whatever time you want, because that's what people in my position should be doing.
Sir, but why do you think that public schools and government schools in midday meals, roti and salt is given in India? If Finland can have such good schools, why is it so abysmal in our country? Or we're not a poor country. If America can have Harvard, Stanford, Yale, the list goes on. Can't we just have one Harvard? Like, you've been MP, you've been a minister for a long time. Why is this apathy? Like, I'm quite emotional at this stage. Do you think people don't care or people don't know, or is it a mix of both?
Because we have had this, I gave you the example of Ashoka University in Delhi.
Yeah.
So first of all, we have to dealing with primary education, secondary and higher education. So I presume all we are talking today is higher education, right? College and universities and all.
Yes.
So we need to be creative. And like you mentioned about the quality of students and the quality of faculty. And it always comes once you have the brand of MIT or John Hopkins, then people know that you're John Hopkins and you have to be good. IIT, you have to be good. IMA, you have to be good. And you need to make sure that people who cannot afford, they may be coming from a school in Narendrapur, but they are the brightest kids. So we have to ensure that for want of money, their admissions are not hampered. So it cannot only be a rich man's club. So this is again the beauty. So most of the universities give you a lot of scholarship. And for want of money, no student gets left out. You need to keep on trying. You need to keep on having idea exchange, seminars. Today we are having virtual. I hope and I'm confident within the next couple of months, we'll be having a cup of tea together and talking on these kind of things. This should be an ongoing thing. And on that, I'm optimistic that will happen. But if you want to go only government, it's difficult. And it's difficult all over the world. Governments have their own ways of dealing. And I'm not talking about education getting into business. And you know why the endowment fund is there in America such a big way? You know why?
Yes, sir, because what you're saying, sir, I would exactly support and echo you because we have created policy papers. So these universities are not for
no,
profit.
I ask you a question that do you know Why,
Why?
why a lot of people who are
Yeah,
wealthy,
yeah.
why they give money, so much money to their universities?
Sir, I
I
can give you one example. Sir, in Johns Hopkins, sir, the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Zayed, he went and had a prostate surgery there, and he gave $1 billion, and they erected a building in his name. So that's one. I think Mr. Bloomberg has given a lot of money to John Hopkins Public School, and I think they have a chair which goes in their name probably. So
so I'll tell you. And this is where we come, this is where government comes.
yes,
Their inheritance tax is huge.
yes,
So if somebody is a billionaire in India, automatically his son, his nephew, his daughter automatically gets all the fund, everything. In
yes,
America, it doesn't happen. If you want to give your children, you know, for instance, Bill Gates,
yes,
he can't give all money to his children. Government will say, okay, you have got $80 billion, just a figure. If you want to give it to your son, first give the government 55%. The rest you can give it. $3 million, there is no tax. So in order for Bill Gates to say that, why should I give it to government? Why not I give it to my university? At least I'll have a chair. The tax structure in America is capitalist, but the tax structure is socialist. And that is the reason all these big people land up
yes.
giving money to universities, and with the result, the quality of university gets much better, and it's a win-win situation. So today, if you tell even 2% of inheritance tax, the lobby which is there will make sure that the finance minister is changed.
That's funny. I would request Dr. Halim to give her experience of working in Germany, and I think Dr. Halim has a question regards to economics and food security. And so over to Dr. Halim.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Boydunath. Thank you, sir. Basically, my area of work is food security, and I am a
Food
political
security.
food security. I am a political ecologist, actually, which also brings in political economy aspects to my area of work. So now coming back to this COVID situation, we know this entire pandemic, COVID-19. Right now, we are facing a lot of economic crisis, and we assume and probably rightly that post COVID-19 situation will be very severe in terms of economic conditions. I mean, anyway, economic slowdown started even before COVID, and the COVID will further take it down. Uh, on this, there are two things that I want to flag here, and would love to get some of your feedback and suggestion. Well, we see now a reverse migration from the cities to the villages when the migrant workers are returning to the villages. And already in the villages, we know rural economy is suffering. Though I personally believe from my own research work that small scale agriculture could be profitable and certain policy interventions are required there. But now with this surplus labor force returning to the villages, what sort of policy should be there to ensure their reintegration in formal economic sector? Probably not all of them can come back to their old working places. If possible, that's the best kind of scenario. But maybe, I mean, let's say five, even 10 to 15% won't be able to return to their own working place, previous working place. So how are we going to incorporate them in the rural belt, in the rural economy? So what sort of priorities government should put? What sort of investment opportunities should be there, both from private and public sector? That is number one. And the number two is we talk a lot about agriculture. There is a common myth that agriculture, particularly small scale agriculture, can never be profitable, which I personally do not agree. After studying a lot of papers, we work with FAO, where we actually we celebrate International Year of Family Farming that we celebrated last year, and we do support small scale smallholder farming. But now there is a stagnation sort of thing. I mean, there are a lot of issues in the Indian context. We know, I don't want to go into
With
details.
regards to
Now,
agriculture, yes,
yeah, of course,
yes.
smallholder production includes agriculture and allied activities. So now coming back to that, what we think, I mean, taking the example of one or two states in particular, and there are other states also, we see there probably are opportunities to strengthen agro-based economy. And so and agro-based industries actually. So it's basically climbing up in the value chain ladder, and there
The
somehow
specific, good. It was
where
specific.
somehow we see that more needs to be done and a gap exists. Do you think our government right now has adequate policy to invest in agro-based industries? And if not, what sort of policy brief should be there, and how, as a civil society organization, we can highlight this issue?
Okay, so I'll tell you very quickly that this is a great opportunity which COVID-19 has brought to our agriculture, because we have realized that unless and until the basic is the food security, if your food security is not there, then the country is not secure. So again, going back to the Nehruvian model of self-sufficiency, modern economists, I don't know why they give us, oh, agriculture must move to the urban area, because there is a motive. Their agenda is that they must work as laborer and must give up their agriculture so that they can take over agriculture. So if you see people, whether it's multinational or, and I'm not talking like a socialist, I totally agree with you that agriculture is profitable, provided you have proper distribution, provided you have this mafias who really hoard, provided you give the cultivator and people who are in agriculture proper infrastructure, which is irrigation, which is storing of their food, which is distributing their food. All these things are together. But I am very happy that now this COVID will make people sit up and realize, like China has done. China is buying land outside China just to cultivate agriculture so that they are not only self-sufficient in food, but they can export as well.
Yes, sir. Being a mental health professional, I wanted to put in a few very important questions. Number one is, as we have, by all conservative estimates, minimum 10% of the population going to have psychosocial issues post this corona outbreak gets over. So what is the government doing actually to meet the mental health needs of the people who are going to get affected? It's a huge number we are looking at, sir. A corollary to this question is, now we have a lot of people who are getting admitted into mental health institutes. A lot of people need specialized care. There are a lot of mental health institutes where only psychiatric patients are being admitted. Now, how do we go about reducing the spread of the infection inside the hospitals? Now, we will have new patients coming in. We will have to put them into hospitals. And that means we're going to expose a lot of people who are inside the hospitals to new people who come in. And a lot of rules are there, a lot of government decisions are there that you cannot test somebody before admitting. So how do you go about tackling this very issue of taking care of somebody who has recently been diagnosed with a severe mental illness and taking care of the people who are already in the hospital, who are stabilized and don't have an illness? So that's a very important aspect the government has to take care of. What are the steps you're going to take in this respect, sir? Now, one important aspect which I don't think so we are neglecting, or we're not neglecting, but we see a lot of influx of migrants coming. Rural mental health needs to be strengthened. We have psychiatrists, we have psychologists, we have psychiatric social workers in the cities, in the tier 2 cities, in the tier 3 cities. But what about the rural thing? Because what we as a society have been trying to provide, the Indian Psychiatric Society, if you look at West Bengal in particular, we have Dr. Gautam, Dr. O.P., Ranjan Bhattacharya, Rajeshri, a lot of people working on telemedicine units there. So is it possible for the government to make sure that these teleconsultation services which we are providing, or the doctors are providing, reach to the level where the rural population is actually aware of something like this happening? There are a lot of areas where we might not have internet connectivity, but we have telephonic connectivity. So somewhere, if the government could train more people, medical officers could train the nursing staff, and then connect to the right people, There would be the initial, people who look after them, and then if they have to escalate the level of care that is required, can we make some measures so that they reach the right people? It's a very important aspect. So bedding doctors in such a short time, psychiatrists, trained psychiatrists, everything is possible. But we can have a mechanism where these people know that there are things which are available and they can reach out to them. So that is one aspect we could think about, sir. And what would be your views on this? And to add to it, sir, can we just, can we have the Mental Health Care Act, we have the National Mental Health Policy. So now is a time where there is economic fallout. A lot of people are jobless. They don't, even if they want to work, they don't have people for whom they can work. They don't have people who can pay them if they work. So it's all going to lead to a lot of chaos. And in this whole chaos, we don't want the mental health, the mentally ill people to lose out. If they don't get medicines, what will get affected first, sir? If people have less money for food, the medical care will get neglected. So what can we have a mechanism where psychotropic drugs are included in the essential medicines list? Free medical, psychotropics can be provided in district mental health hospitals, CHCs. Somewhere can we have a mechanism where people can just go, they have illness, they can continue taking treatment. Even if they don't reach the doctor, it's okay. If they continue the treatment for some days, we have medical officers, we can train them. So that is one aspect that the government would look after. Would do a lot of good for everybody, sir. What are your views on this, sir?
See, there are two kinds of problems which are going to come post this virus. One is of livelihood, jobs, and second would be a psychological problem, because this is for the first time that everybody is locked down for more than 2 months, and there is some kind of fear and panic. So government will have to treat in both ways. Now, a difficult part would be to get the economic back on rail. And for that, I think government has to increase the spending, got to look after the people, free rationing, lot of dole outs will have to be given, because a lot of shops are going to be closed, like restaurant, like the hospitality business. So business things are going to come down. A lot of people will be out of job. So government will have to really, really look after people who do not have the earnings. Yeah, I think you have already answered. Basically this we'll have to leave it to the experts. But my common sense tells me that you first have to segregate in the sense that those people who are above age 60 or whatever, and those people who have got medical history. They may be young, but they may be having asthma or heart or diabetes, blood pressure. So that vulnerable group needs to be looked after in a different way. There has to be a lot of looking after to be done for them. As far as normal younger generation are concerned, they also need constant monitoring, but more so to the vulnerable group. So the basic social distancing, now these people who are unfortunately part of a different group, they will require a special assistance. Earlier, if you had, let's say, one person for a group of just out of the blue for 2025, you may have to have one person for 5.
Yes.
So you have to need more people. You call them assistants, you call them whatever name you want to do, call them nurses, call them anything you want to. But you need more people to assist smaller groups. So you have to bring the groups down. Numbers should be down so the monitoring is done properly. In the rural area, I think there's a lot of bondage as far as community is concerned, which is more in rural area. That we call that paraculture area people. They are really good to look after people, and I think in rural area families matter a lot. But the only problem in rural area is poverty. So I think a lot of help needs to be given to such people, and that can only be done through government and NGO. Government alone will not be sufficient. So I think a lot of love, care, and understanding that why, what is the background, why this unfortunate situation has come. So every patient, every individual would have a different story. So I think they require a lot of care and love. They can work, and these are the areas where you require trained people. Like we have ashas everywhere,
Yes.
but that kind of a model where you have to develop parallel to asha, and you have to train people, because this is a very specialized area.
Yes.
And as far as the legal provisions are concerned, you have to work with legislators, both in the state level or at the federal level also.
Thank you so much, sir.
So just to conclude what you were saying, I mean, not to conclude, but I mean, concluding from my side, my question. So I mean, very happy to know that you also think that agriculture is the future of India. We cannot actually ignore the entire agrarian sector, and we need to look into the problems of the agrarian sector to make it more robust, the small scale agriculture. So, and probably that this entire agrarian issue needs far more discussion, and it's not possible in one session today. So we hope to keep this discussion also ongoing in future. And,
Yes. So, you have to go back to the Gandhinian model,
right.
where the villages are self-sufficient. And
Exactly.
villages can only be self-sufficient if they are monetarily rewarded. I have
Right.
agricultural land, and I only know how difficult it is. And if the land is small, then I think we have to follow the Amul model, where even
Collectivization, cooperatives, exactly.
whether you have two cows or you have got 25, doesn't matter. All of you can give the milk there. And I think this is where we have to encourage, like Israel done great job. It can be done, but I think somewhere down the line, for some reason, the between business, bureaucracy, and politics, they don't want this. They want hold on to the agriculture and to the village for their vote bank. And I think somewhere down the line, they want to keep them where they are.
Correct.
And we have seen it in Bengal also during last 35 years. And that model didn't work. You see, we need to liberate the farmer class. We need to give them respect, not only their vote, but they have to be respected.
That's right. Sir, just one last question, which is far away from this agriculture and education, but it's very contemporary debate which is going on in public domain. It's very different question. It's about this new app, and it is linked with the data privacy and the lack of data privacy act in Indian legal system. And this entire issue of Arogya Setu app, where government is saying that in the COVID-19 situation, it is mandatory for everyone, almost everyone, to download it. So, as a respected politician and a member of parliament, do you think there is any legal framework that can actually push us or kind of make it mandatory for everyone to install this app?
See, data is the new gold. And there is, and it is nothing secret about it. People want data. And the reason they want data is because they want to control not you, but your mind. They don't want you to think beyond what they want you to think. So one of the casualty of COVID is democracy itself. And today they will want you to download your everything, so that they will know if Mr. X is speaking. They will know how your chemistry is working within you. And they will know that whether you are supporting you or not. We are getting into a dangerous zone. So whether data privacy and all will come later, but we have to ensure there is democracy. And unfortunately, most of the institutions, whether it is judiciary or down the line, is getting compromised. And today we are already in an emergency rule. Today it's virtually a center rule, and they tell you what you should do. So elected governments, again, going back to American model, the governors, you can't dictate a governor. If the governor of Texas said that, hell with you, I will do whatever I think good for Texas, because they're elected. So governors are like the chief ministers. So the chief minister of the state must have the power, and the federal structure should work. And I think India would be in the greatest danger. And the way we have seen the migrants, the way they are disrespected, there is no dignity. And somebody told me that the Honorable Supreme Court took the case which dealt with supplying liquor at home and did not feel that Article 21 is important for the migrant laborer, and that issue was not taken. I think this is a dangerous thing. I have nothing against liquor, but I certainly want the migrants' right for human dignity, and the human rights should come much before anything else. If I were the judge, I would take this suo motu. I would not even wait for somebody to come and apply before me. So we are in a dangerous zone as far as democracy is concerned. Not only India, you see what's happening in Hungary. So I think bright people like you have to be alert, and you have to engage with policymakers, whether at the state level, at the village level, at the panchayat level, and it has to be done in a very, very intelligent manner.
Thank you so much,
So
sir.
basically, I think we've basically run out of time today. We thank Dinesh Trivedi. He's a very veteran politician. He's a ex-pilot. I think he went to drama school once, and of course, India's railway minister and health minister. So it was excellent to have him here. And we will be organizing a CAV conclave in Kolkata. And Dr. Jenny Halim. And I thank especially Dinesh Trivedi again, because he's taken a lot of time from his busy schedule, and he's a gold mine of knowledge. And he is the best person to speak of education because his education was done in US. So I think we will work with him in this regards. So, sir, if you could give a concluding remark, and we'll end the session.
Thank you very much for having me here, and I can assure you all my support anytime you want. And in the process, I'm sure I'm going to learn much more than what I would contribute.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So thank you so much,
Thank you.
Sunny. Yeah.